All right, welcome everyone. We'll get underway with the last sort of dual plenary of day one. So today, this is about the seismic risk management of, the review of seismic risk management in existing buildings. And so we have three speakers for you today. First up, we have Matt. Matt McDermott is the Manager for Building Performance and Resilience at MB. His team's got a policy focus on building resilience encompassing climate, fire, and seismic resilience of existing buildings, so quite a broad remit. He's worked across public policy, resource management, and land use planning across both local and central government. We have Jenni Tipler. Jenni manages the Resilient Buildings team at Wellington City Council. Her background is in structural engineering, public policy and regulation. She's worked both in the private sector as a structural engineer and the public sector where she worked at MB managing the building code. It's a current role with Wellington City Council that brings her here today, where she's responsible for implementation of earthquake-prone building policy. Wellington's amongst the first TAs to encounter the sharp end of the current regime and some of the really tough enforcement challenges and other non-engineering issues that surface. And so with this building on Wellington's long and proactive history in seismic risk policy, Jenni brings a very insightful perspective. So welcome, Jenni. And Henry Tatham is a Wellington-based structural engineer with Becker, and he represents NZSEE on the Joint Committee for Seismic Assessment and Retrofit. He represents the society pretty well, I might add, and very actively. Also represents his rural roots pretty well too. For the last 15 odd years, his focus has been seismic advice in relation to new and existing buildings. We're here to talk about existing buildings, obviously, but it's all part of the whole, and this puts Henry very much on the cold face of the engineering and industry practice side of things, so you can see the perspective that Henry will bring. So Matt has a flight back to Wellington at 6:05 p.m, so Matt's going to speak first. Matt's competently guiding the team at MB through this review, who are doing a fantastic job at hearing everyone's voices, ours being one of those, speaking for the society. A very warm welcome, Matt, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation to speak at this conference. My name is Matt McDermott. I'm the Manager of Building Performance and Resilience at MB. One of my first tasks when I started in that role was I was given the gift of doing a review of the earthquake-prone building system in New Zealand. So, this is not going to be a shock and awe presentation, so if you're looking for an indication of what the review findings will be, or what the new system would look like, then I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. We've got quite a lot of work to do, so what I wanted to do is just talk you through our work program, what we're hearing about in terms of the kinds of issues that we're hearing from stakeholders, talk about how we work with ministers and cabinet and the decision-making process, and then the next steps in terms of the opportunity for learner people like you folk to provide some feedback to us and tell us how we can make the system work better going forward. So, what have we got there? I want to move on. So there'll be no surprises about the earthquake-prone building system as it sits at the moment. It's a system that's been in place since 2017. You'll all be familiar with the Canterbury earthquakes in 2010, 2011. There was a significant Royal Commission. As a result of that, the government decided that no longer could we have a sort of a devolved system where the management of earthquake-prone buildings was led by 67 TAs. They were looking for a coordinated, centralised national approach. So we now have a system that's been in place for several years. Since then, there have been indications, of course, with any regulatory system, that things could be working better than they are. There are some things that are also working quite well. But it's a consequence of the system that's now been in place for some time. The new government of the day said, we have some concerns and we would like MB to look into those concerns. So that's where we're at the moment. Excuse me, next one. You'll be familiar with this. This slide is what we call amongst ourselves and the team at MB. This is the slide that talks about a little bit about what the kinds of earthquake-prone buildings go into the bucket, as we talk about it colloquially at work, and how buildings get out of the bucket. So the TEA has a role, of course, to identify a building that is potentially earthquake-prone. No surprises with that, you'll all be familiar with that. Building owner then has to get an earthquake assessment to determine whether it is an EPB. That assessment is then submitted to the council. They decide and confirm that the building is an EPB. Council issues a notice, and you'll all be familiar with the notices, and if you live in Wellington, you'll have seen a plethora of notices around the city. And then, of course, building owners have a series of obligations to remediate those buildings or to demolish those buildings. And it's the process for determining of remediation or demolition that we're hearing about from many stakeholders that is not working as well as it could be. This diagram really just shows you the breadth of the review that we're doing. So while nominally we're focused on those buildings, the existing buildings that have been given a notice that they are less than 34% of the MBS, actually we're interested in a broader view of the system as a whole. So we are focused on the MBS and those buildings that have a notice that say less than 34% of the MBS, but we're also interested in those drivers for and what motivates people to remediate their buildings to over and above 34% and sometimes up in the case of up to 100% or more. So we're really interested in how markets perform. We're interested in how people behave when they were given a notice and how they work together to make decisions to ensure that their building will be safe going forward. So it's quite an extensive review. Before I talk a little bit more about the process for this review and what we're hearing, you will be familiar that buildings with a notice on them have been given a 4-year extension. So we went through, made some changes to the Building Act late last year. If an existing building had a notice on it prior to April 2024, that notice hadn't been expired, they were given a 4-year extension. And then there's a possibility of another extension of up to 2 years on top of that by I won't bore you with the detail, but there's a government process where we can get a further extension up to 2 years on top of that. The purpose of that is to provide temporary relief, of course, and it provides MB and the government with the space to do a review of the current system. That's where we're at right now. We're right in the middle of the review. The government expectations, of course, are quite high, and we'll be going back in the near future and say, this is what we've heard from stakeholders, this is what we think could be done differently. This is a little bit about how we've segmented the review. So we are what we call amongst ourselves and the team at MB, we're doing a current state analysis. That's essentially a problem definition. So we have spoken to a range of stakeholders. We've been talking to engineers. We've been talking to the owners of multi-unit, multi-storey apartments in Wellington and in other cities. We've been talking to the owners of government EPBs. We've been talking to insurers, and we've been talking to banks. We've been talking to councils, and they all have a range of perspectives to share. It's not all bad. We are hearing some quite positive aspects about the system at the moment in terms of the motivation to drive for better building outcomes. But we are hearing, particularly from the residential sector and the commercial sector, that they're really grappling with some quite difficult, complex issues in terms of how they go about the decisions to remediate those buildings and navigate what they perceive to be quite a complex system. So that's where we're at the moment. Of course, we have to provide some advice to ministers on what the system could look like going forward. We haven't quite got to that stage yet. We'll be reporting back to ministers and cabinet around what we describe as a problem definition. If ministers agree with that, they'll be looking for some advice on how we can make the system better than it is at the moment. A couple of other aspects to it. We've outsourced, there's work that MB's doing, but we've also outsourced some work as well because we can't do it all. We're doing a cost-benefit analysis, and no doubt some of you will be involved in that cost-benefit analysis. That's an analysis of the current system. So we're looking for a comprehensive economic analysis of the current seismic system for existing buildings. And there will be some cost-benefit outcomes varied by building typology and region and building use. So that's going to reveal some really useful information in terms of what's working well and what's not working so well. We've also outsourced some work around willingness to pay. That's a really behavioural insight study. And of course, you'll all be familiar with the notion that after a seismic event, people are willing to pay more to ensure that life safety and that buildings will be safe. That's a natural human response. But as memories diminish over time, people feel less inclined to that, to pay for safe buildings, and they'd rather have $1 in their pocket and take some risk around life safety down the track. We have done quite a lot of work, thanks to the help of some of you in this room, to look at overseas jurisdictions. So we want to know what's working well in overseas jurisdictions, what the alternatives might be to an MBS system. So we have done quite an extensive desktop analysis looking at what works well and what's not working so well in overseas jurisdictions. I feel like I've already talked about this slide. We are very much in the middle of the barriers and drivers workstream right now. And then we'll be moving forward to the future state in the near future. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting close to that. Says down there, compliance and enforcement's a key part of the work, and it is, because we want to know whether councils will have the right tools to support building owners with a remediation process, whatever that might look like going forward. But a key part of the work also has to be around costs and benefits. So when we advise ministers and cabinet, they naturally, of course, want to know how building owners are affected in the real world, and what the role for government might be, if any, in terms of supporting building owners. So they are very concerned about cost impacts on normal people like you and I, cost impacts on businesses, and of course the cost impacts, the fiscal impacts on government building owners, because pockets are not that deep. And governments have a range of priorities that they need to fund. So our work will be looking at a cost-benefit analysis, and we would ideally, but probably difficult in this case, be looking at, from a theoretical perspective, net present value and being able to show that the benefits of any new system exceed the costs. That's our theoretical approach. Whether we can do that in practice is a separate matter, because we have to weigh up quantitative matters and qualitative matters. It's going to be quite a complex exercise for us to work through. What are we hearing? I think I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to go to the next one. I think the next one is probably perhaps more illustrative. This one. So that slide over there, as you know, the current system is all about life safety. We want buildings to be safe. But what we're hearing from stakeholders is that, particularly from the residential sector and from banks, is that they're finding the system really difficult to navigate. And so can you imagine if you overlay that with other obligations around under the Unit Titles Act and the need for joint decisions and shared decisions on if to remediate and the level to remediate, it becomes very, very complex for consumers and for households. We're hearing from banks and insurers that the MBS system is nice, but they're actually taking into account a range of other drivers and factors in terms of decisions on whether to lend or not to lend, or to insure or to not insure. So they have their own risk assessment processes. They're familiar with the building stock in New Zealand. They're also looking to overseas in terms of the cost of reinsurance, and then they're looking at underlying geology as well, substrates, and they're making their own decisions. So the MBS is a factor, but what we're hearing is that it's not a key factor in terms of their decisions on how to insure, the levels to which they insure. Very much driven by markets rather than regulation, if you like. Going back to building owners, not only are there difficulties for them in terms of navigating requirements under unit titles legislation, they're telling us that they're just, first of all, there's the cost of remediation. So, for example, in rural areas and provincial areas, they're telling us things like, I have an MBS, but the building that I occupy, the building that I own, it's only worth about $100,000. But you're telling me that the cost to remediate that building is something in the order of $200,000 to $250,000. I can't afford to do it. So there's some really interesting trade-offs in there for rural and provincial communities, and the trade-offs are quite stark. It's to walk away from the building or to demolish the building. And in case of demolition, of course, often that exceeds the capital value of the building as well. So there's some really interesting issues there in rural and provincial communities that we are working through at the moment. For the residential EPBs in Wellington, of course, there is the cost factor associated with remediation. There's also the cost of insurance and the drivers from the insurance sector and from the banking sector who are have much higher expectations around levels of remediation, which of course pushes up costs. They're having difficulties working with councils because the tools that councils have in some cases are quite limited and the support that councils can provide is quite limited. Councils, like the government, don't have deep pockets, so they're very limited by the tools that they have, which are essentially set out in the Building Act. I could probably go on, but there's a flavour of the kinds of issues that we are hearing. In essence, what we are being told is that we have a system in place that was okay at the time in 2017, with the earthquakes that were fresh in our minds at that time, but we've learnt a lot in terms of how the system's working at the moment and what's not working well, and it's time for some change. I have heard from some people that it's described as a blanket system that treats all areas of the country, irrespective of whether it's a high, medium or low seismic zone, or whether it's a rural building or a metropolitan building. They feel that the system that we have lacks nuance and flexibility. So that's the presenting issue that we're trying to work through at the moment. A little bit, I think I've probably talked enough about that slide there. I'll go on to the timeframes and the process. Of course, governments always want you to go faster, and that's the space that we're in at the moment. That's normal, of course, as public servants. That's the environment that we work in. So we're going as quickly as we can. There is an expectation that we will be reporting back to our minister in the near future. So we're working as quickly as we can. If ministers agree with our proposed direction of travel, there'll be an opportunity for further input and comment. So we hope that there will be the classic process of pulling together a public discussion document with the issues, detailed options for system change, so that an audience like this can actually see, touch and feel what a new system might look like and provide us with a technical feedback that we can help with system design. And then we'll be making recommendations on decisions for system change. And if the government decides and agrees with those, we'll be working with the government to introduce legislation. I can't tell you if that will happen, but my sense is that there will be, the expectation is that there will be changes to the Building Act for as it relates to the EPBs. The timeframes for that are fairly fluid right now, but of course we've got an election late next year, late 2026, so you can do your own maths on that. There will be an expectation that we move away from issues and options to decisions and implementation of a new system before late 2026. I can't really say much more than that, because at the end of the day, that's the decisions that ministers make, not officials. That's my presentation, that's my overview. I'm really sorry I can't share with you much more than what I already have, but suffice to say that there will be an opportunity for some input in terms of what the detailed system design will look like in the near future. It will be this side of Christmas, almost certainly. So thank you. I'll hand back to... Thank you.
Afternoon all. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the history of seismic risk management in New Zealand, and that logically would go first. But unfortunately Matt's schedule has dictated a quick change, so I'm second up. In 1848, the Marlborough earthquake struck the top of the South Island. It was a magnitude 7.5 event, relatively shallow, and it caused about 2 minutes of shaking in Wellington. So a fairly long period of shaking, and it damaged almost all the brick and stone buildings in the city. As a result, lots of buildings in Wellington were rebuilt in timber. This was thought to be a major contributing factor in reducing the damage and loss of life in the 1855 Wairarapa earthquake, which also caused significant shaking and led to the uplift of chunks of the harbour. The response to the 1848 earthquake is one of the first recorded examples of seismic risk management that I could find. But as noted by G.A. Ibe, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in a 1975 NZSEE bulletin, A History of Anti-Seismic Measures in New Zealand, there were no major events from 1855 to 1929, and interest in earthquakes waned. Despite this, in the 1920s, earthquake problems, I guess exams perhaps, started appearing in the engineering school at the Canterbury College, with impetus coming from events in San Francisco and Santa Barbara in 1906 and 1925. The 29 Murchison earthquake occurred, killing 17 people. This significantly raised awareness again, but its impact was quickly dwarfed by the 31 Napier earthquake. It was the Napier earthquake that really kick-started formal seismic risk management through building codes in New Zealand. The 1942 Wairarapa earthquake continued this, and there was something like 20,000 chimneys toppled in that event in the lower North Island. And this was one of the impetuses for the formation of the Earthquake Commission in 1945. And we are, I still believe, one of the most insured countries in the world for earthquakes. Fingers crossed that continues. So 3 major earthquakes, 29, 31 and 42, would have been a rude awakening after a number of benign decades where our urban centres hadn't been heavily impacted. So let's just have a look at some of the things that happened over that period, subsequent period. So the first part of seismic risk management has been the codes. This will be known to many of you, fairly well publicised, and it began in 1935 with the NZS 95, and there's been many updates regularly over the years since, often those updates aligning with updates to the seismic hazard, as we've recently seen with the draft TS 1170. The problem with this aspect has always been that it only looks forward, it doesn't look back. And so new buildings, the quality of new buildings is gradually increasing, but the overall performance of existing buildings is not covered by any increase in code that we introduce to deal with new knowledge. And of course, it's existing buildings that we're talking about today. So there has been legislation around for some time to deal with existing buildings. The Municipal Corporations Act in 1968 was the first act that allowed local councils to apply to the government to take up powers to classify earthquake-prone buildings and require owners to reduce or remove the danger, demolish. Most major cities and towns took up the legislation, some much earlier than others. At the time, the legislation applied to unreinforced masonry and unreinforced concrete buildings assessed to have less than half the capacity of the 1965 standard. Over the period of 1968 to 2003, Wellington dealt with 500 of 700 buildings identified as earthquake-prone under the MCA, and they were seismically retrofitted. This is not bad progress. Over a 36-year period, the Act was enforced. A steady reduction in seismic risk across Wellington, across the Wellington building stock. One problem with these retrofits, which became obvious, was that the retrofit standard unfortunately didn't keep pace with the new knowledge and codes. So many of these retrofits were ultimately done to 2/3 of the 1965 code, which in today's seismic money isn't much. Uplift of seismic standards has been fairly onerous and for some time has been managed by the governors of engineering pulling the ductility lever. With the latest increases, this lever unfortunately seems to have run out of travel. By the late 90s, early 2000s, the lack of major events in New Zealand meant it was earthquakes in Northridge and Kobe that increased concern amongst practicing engineers and professionals that the 68 legislation was outdated and new legislation was required. NZSEE, among others, pushed for this legislation, and in 2004 a new Building Act was passed. This increased the scope of buildings that could be identified as earthquake prone and also increased the minimum standard to 1/3 of the new building standard. The other key feature was that each TA had to create their own earthquake prone building policy, which included timeframes to identify and address, and the TAs could set the minimum standard required to be met to make a building not earthquake prone. Interestingly, quite different from the Act that came in 27 with much more central direction. The intention of this was to allow each community to manage earthquake prone buildings how they wanted to, but overall would result in a steady reduction in seismic risk over a period of many years. Policies were allowed to be either active or passive. Active meaning TAs would go out and identify and notify owners that their building could be potentially earthquake prone, and there was a process from there. Or passive, buildings came in for the building consent for work, they would then look at the building at that time and decide whether it met a threshold. What councils chose to do varied, with most in high seismic zones opting for the active, and I believe Wellington City Council was at the forefront of that, and passive becoming more popular in the medium and lower seismic zones. This piece of legislation had been enforced for 7 years when the Christchurch earthquake occurred, and a review of the framework was intended for that year but was put on hold for obvious reasons. Following the Christchurch earthquake, heightened awareness of seismic issues led to the 2016 amendment, which Matt's just talked about, and perhaps in hindsight put the whole scheme on too many steroids, with overly ambitious timeframes, particularly for high seismic regions, which ultimately have become unachievable. Which brings us to here we are today with a review of the legislation currently ongoing. Overlaid and in behind the legislative tools to manage seismic risk has been the input and advocacy of NZSEE and other technical societies. This has come in many forms, but one of the most notable has been leading the production of various guidelines for engineers, as highlighted on this slide. A tradition seems to have developed as far back as the Brown Book, that these guides are simply known by the colour of their front cover. We're not a particularly imaginative bunch. Sometimes with a year attached, we've now got C5 Yellow 2018 and C5 Yellow 2025. And then on top of all of this, we've had various seismic events over the last 100 years, which have impacted the public awareness of seismic risk. I have shown a red line reflecting how public awareness might have ebbed and flowed since the Napier earthquake, and Matt alluded to this in his words. A quiet period for most of the 1900s and early 2000s, followed by a very active period with a significant uptick in awareness. During the quiet periods, action was driven in large part by advocacy from the engineering community, and during these times, without regular earthquake reminders, the public and political will for changes in legislation was lower. As we have seen throughout history, the advent of a couple of major events changes this, as happened in 2011. Only time will tell us where the ebb and flow goes next, but there is a certain irony in this ebb and flow that many older folk in the room may identify with. For many years, NZSEE has put a lot of effort into getting people to care enough about seismic risk, and now it feels like we are putting at least some of our effort into having people care just a little bit less. Thanks, Andy, for identifying my rural roots. I'm going back to them again. Coupled with the ebb and flow of the public awareness of seismic risk is an overall change in acceptance of risk with the public at large. What once may have been acceptable is now a no-go. For example, on this slide is an aerial picture of the main house and farmyard where my father grew up in the 1940s. Dad claims that before he went to school, so he was under the age of 5, he was allowed to wander down the driveway to play at the creek some 400 odd metres from the house. Of course, whether this is true depends on Dad's memory. Given at a later stage in his life, he discovered he had a slug gun pellet in his hip, of which he has no recollection. I did sometimes doubt what I was being told. After all, he couldn't remember being shot. I'm not sure the average parent would be that laid back about kids playing unsupervised in the river 400 metres from their house, pinging slug pellets around and so on. Instead, these days we give our kids necklaces with an ear tag on them. We are more urban, families are smaller, and so on. But the more risk-averse society becomes, the harder it is getting to keep all the various risks that occur in life in perspective, seismic risk included. So when someone is faced with deciding to occupy an earthquake-prone building or not, many now err with the not. Although with the release of the MB risk guidance, exits from buildings have reduced, at least anecdotally anyway. Coming back to the timelines, I've merged all that I've covered into one single timeline. This is purely to indicate how busy things have got in the last 10 to 20 years. I have noticed this personally in my own career, where for the first 10 years my general focus was generally new construction, but for the last 10 years has it been far more focused on existing buildings, which in many ways is a good thing. We have a lot of existing buildings, and rather than knock them down and build new, we can give them a new lease on life and some seismic upgrades and hopefully a facelift at the same time. Just switching away from the history for a second, I just wanted to give a brief update on some of the work I'm involved with as part of the Joint Committee and the low-rise building stream, which some of you may remember me talking about last year. So we have been working with the team at MB to provide some advice around low-rise timber building typology, and we're coming up with some of these diagrams. This is just an example of when this type of structure could be considered to be low enough risk that it need not be covered by any legislation, and some examples of when potentially it should be considered by any legislation. We're working on a Chapter C11, so reinforced concrete masonry, That's something that came up in the workshops we held a couple of years ago. Look out for the draft of this for public comment in the third quarter of this year. And we began some work on helping engineers work through the mode of failure requirements or commentary within the guidelines. That was initially focused on low-rise. That's got a slightly broader mandate, and you'll hear more about the document that's coming out in relation to that tomorrow at the Joint Committee session. So I just wanted to leave you with two things before I finish. The first is New Zealand has a long history of seismic risk management based on the philosophy of gradual but continual building improvement, leading to reduced seismic risk and Advocacy by NZSEE members has been an important part of that, along with actual earthquakes themselves. While the future of seismic risk management is currently under review, I hope that the gradual but continual building improvement philosophy is not lost, and that I can look back in another 30 years and say I have played a small part, along with many others in this room, in continuing this philosophy. Maybe we can all look a bit like that weightlifter on the right one day. I still have hope. Along with this, I would like to leave you all with a challenge. It is important that we as engineers embrace engaging with our clients and the public to discuss and explain seismic risks and the importance of helping our clients make balanced calls on risk, rather than retreating to the safety of binary safe, not safe decisions. While helping our clients understand the balance of risks might be uncomfortable for many of us, the reality is we are best placed to do this as we have the best knowledge on the issues. So if you don't feel comfortable with this topic, I encourage you to look at the resources available to help you learn and get more comfortable so that we can all play our part in seismic risk management. That way, you can be the little guy on the right and not the little guy on the left. And on that note, I'll ask Jenni to come up for her slot.
Just interject quickly before Jenni starts, just to remind everyone that for this plenary we will use the conference app for Q&A, so I think we should have a couple of roaming mics once Jenni's presented her talk, but also feel free to start plugging some questions in through the conference app.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Jenni Tipler and I manage the Building Resilience team at Wellington Council. Like many of you, I'm kind of into numbers, so that's what I'm going to focus on today in the context of earthquake-prone buildings in Wellington. Firstly, I'm interested in what the data says. What does the data say about buildings in Wellington? And what does it say about how our earthquake-prone building system is impacting behaviours? Thirdly, and perhaps more importantly, I'm interested in what the data is really telling us about what we can do better, we as local government, we as engineers, and we as participants in a review of the wider system settings. Let's dive into the breakdown of EPBs in Wellington. As you can see from these graphs, the majority of earthquake-prone buildings in Wellington are small, low-rise structures, and they're spread all over the city and the suburbs. As a whole, we estimate there are about 30,000 occupants across all of these buildings, so not an insignificant number. But over half of these occupants sit in the largest 10% of buildings. Now, I don't contend that those largest 10% are easy to remediate, but on a building-by-building basis, you would definitely get better bang for your buck by focusing on those. Historically, we've seen that when earthquake-prone buildings get resolved, about 2/3 are by strengthening and 1/3 by demolition. Looking at these numbers, we can expect to see hundreds of buildings being demolished in Wellington. Of course, whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing will depend on who you ask or what day of the week you read the Dominion Post. Digging into the structural breakdown, we see a dominance of concrete, URM and timber buildings in terms of the primary structural system. But when considering buildings with URM elements, the dominance of this becomes clearer, with over 50% of EPBs having URM. This is what the data says. but what's it really telling us about what we can do better? If, and this is a big if, we believe that the current stock of EPBs represents the highest safety risks, then perhaps for council, it looks like focusing on the largest 10% of buildings, making sure that those biggest buildings get remediated. Secondly, and I'll say thank you in advance to Hamish and Alistair, it looks also for engineers at developing cost-efficient solutions for remediating unreinforced masonry and concrete low-rise structures. Now, I've been at council less than a year, so when I joined, I wanted to understand more about how the EPB system had worked in the past. I took a look at how Wellington Council earthquake-prone building numbers have changed over time, and honestly, I was a bit shocked. Some of you will know this already, but for those who don't, Wellington Council took a really proactive approach to identifying earthquake-prone buildings. Between 2006 and 2013-ish, we commissioned thousands of IEPs for buildings across the city, both private and public. And you can clearly see the results of this in the increased EPB numbers in that time. We also see a bit of a blip in the numbers just prior to 2017, which I had assumed was related to profiling work in anticipation under the new EPB methodology. But as is often the case, I was wrong. That blip was actually the team clearing a backlog of IEPs in preparation for the new system. So when we look closely at the time the new national EPB legislation was introduced through Building Act changes, the impact is imperceivable. I appreciate that this won't look the same for all councils, but this is what we see in Wellington. The more I looked into it, the more one thing kept popping up again and again. IEPs. We have thousands of them, orders of magnitude more than we have for DSAs. What's more, I found over 1,000 older IEPs of buildings that are not earthquake prone with a rating between 34 and 45% MBS. So over 1,000 IEPs between 34 and 45% MBS that still in 2025 are used as justification that the building doesn't need strengthening. Just to be clear, and I can see Rob looking at me here, I'm not here to raise questions about IEPs, and I have an enormous amount of confidence in the engineers who did that work. But times have changed, and I keep asking myself, where does the risk really sit? Does our biggest risk sit with the URM buildings on Cuba Street? Maybe, probably. Or does our biggest risk sit with the high-rises? Because even with higher MBS scores, the impact of failure is so much more significant. One thing we probably can agree on is that the risk doesn't sit with relatively isolated small structures that no one uses. So again, I'll ask the question, what's the data saying and what could we do better? For a start, we could take a closer look at our IEPs. However, I've deliberately used a zombie icon here because no matter how old these IEPs are, we actually have no way of killing them. Just think about that. More broadly, we, as in all of us, could consider ways to better account for social impacts and consequences in the advice and support we give. I want to shift now to talk about the behaviours we see under the current EPB system, but I need to start with just a little bit of context. Ultimately, as a regulator, whether it's local or central, the behaviour of people in the system will inform the appropriate response. There are numerous frameworks that can be used, but my favourite is called VADE. V is for voluntary behaviour. When you see this type of behaviour in the system, you want to make it easy. Use incentives, inform, advise, guide. A is for assisted. This is people who maybe don't comply, but they don't mean to. They would if they could. And in those cases, we should try and help them to comply. D is for directed behaviour. This is people who will only comply if it suits them, and in those cases we tend to deter and direct, maybe through formal warnings. And then there's enforced behaviour at the very top of the pyramid, where we use the full force of the law. Have a think about where you think engineers sit in this framework. Where do you think most of your clients sit? My observation of our current EPB system would be it seems to be based on the idea that enforcement and direction will be necessary in many cases. In other words, there is a lot of stick and no carrot. What we see in the market is actually pretty proactive behaviour. 350 earthquake-prone buildings have been strengthened in Wellington compared to over 1,000 non-earthquake-prone buildings. That's over 1,000 buildings that were strengthened not because they have to, but because the market or other factors have driven that behaviour. We also saw in 2024 that the earthquake-prone buildings that were strengthened were done 5 years in advance of their deadlines expiring. It seems then that actually the statutory deadlines and mandates aren't dictating behaviour in many cases. Anecdotally, insurance and finance are far bigger drivers in getting buildings strengthened than the EPB mandates are. On the flip side, we deal with a lot of people who want to comply, who want safer buildings, but feel completely stuck. In terms of the VADE framework, we should be assisting these people. And believe me, we really try. And we have a team of case managers who support owners, but there's only so many tools at their disposal. So often the owners remain stuck. This is why prior to the deadline extensions, we were predicting as much as 70% rates of non-compliance for the wave of deadlines expiring in 2027. At the end of the day, these stuck owners don't comply, and they end up getting treated with the full force of the law, like serial recidivists. Surely we can do better, right? But what might that look like? So for the first one, I'm looking at central government, and it's a real shame that Matt's not here anymore. But I think we need greater assistance for owners who want to comply. The other part, and this may be a little bit controversial, is that actually the data suggests that strengthening mandates may not be needed in a lot of cases where market drivers are doing a good job of managing risk. In this case, all that would be needed is to support these drivers. To wrap up, if there was one thing I'd want you to take from this presentation, it's that numbers are really interesting, but you already know that. So the second thing to take away is that different numbers will tell you different things. In the context of a legislative review, where there's a question about what parts of the system get canned and what the future looks like, it's really important to look at as much data as possible, listen to what it's saying, and use it to inform decisions about what we can all do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So we obviously had to have Matt make a swift exit. You would have seen him depart. We have had Ken, our Chief Engineer of Building Performance and Resilience at MB, volunteer to step up and take a few questions on Matt's behalf, wearing his MB hat, one presumes. We don't seem to have any questions, at least that I can see on the live Q&A, but we do have some roaming mics, so if anyone has a question from the floor that they'd like to throw to our presenters, then feel free to raise your hand. Stu?
Message for Ken.
Yes, I might be.
I was quite interested to hear what we've observed from other countries about other systems of managing earthquake risk in existing buildings, and if you could share some of those with us.
Sorry, say the last part again, Stu?
I'd be quite interested to hear if there are other interesting ways that other countries are managing earthquake risks in existing buildings that you've learned as part of this process?
Lots to learn there, actually. Quite a good study was done by Olga Filipova and her colleagues, and there are many things to take away, so let me just highlight a couple. One is the focus on building typologies. So our system, we're trying to sort of address all buildings at the same time, whereas in many countries, they tend to say, okay, let's focus on unreinforced masonry. Once that's ticked off, let's focus on soft story wood frame. Tick that off. Then the really tricky one, non-ductile concrete. So that's one aspect. Another is the idea of allowing incremental retrofit. And if you do some degree of risk reduction, that can buy you more time within the time frames to meet your full requirements. The other is the idea of just focusing on the critical vulnerability, such as in Taiwan, where they have a soft story program for residential concrete buildings with open first stories, where the focus is entirely on addressing that one critical vulnerability. There may be other things going on in the building, but you reduce the risk by addressing that one vulnerability. So that's a sample of the things that we've seen and are considering.
Take a question from Boyao. So Jenni, it is interesting to see the numbers. Do you see any differences in the behaviour of private owners versus public building owners in your data analysis?
Yes, I think that's a short answer. And Charlotte Brown from Resilient Organisations has been doing research into that and can speak to it a lot more than I can. But generally we see that public building owners tend to be a lot sort of happier to comply than private owners who face additional difficulties.
And a difficult one will stick with you, Jenni, from Laura. Are other TAs seeing similar results on voluntary retrofitting, or are Wellington building owners just inherently better?
I think, obviously Wellington building owners are inherently better. Look, I'm not sure about other TAs. I think in a lot of cases the TAs, the deadlines haven't come up yet, and so Wellington Council's in a slightly unique position of having actually used some of the enforcement tools in the Building Act, getting a court order to go and strengthen a building, looking at prosecution. These are things that we as Wellington Council, just because we're in a high seismic zone, sort of have to lead the pack on. And unfortunately, I think some of the other TAs are just waiting to see what lessons we have at the end of it. So that they can develop their policy.
Just as a follow-up to that, I mean, I think MB is recognizing that the pressures and challenges are quite different in provincial New Zealand than in Wellington. If I were to say there were two really big groups that are the really challenging to overcome the for the Wellington residential multi-unit apartment buildings, and for small town New Zealand. And I think Matt referred to the challenges there of just financially making any kind of mitigation stack up. I think those are probably our biggest challenges ahead of us in the review.
Any other questions from the floor? No, I will take another one here. I think any of you could possibly have an attempt at answering this from Moise. With respect to market forces on strengthening, what are your thoughts on getting real estate value and or property contents insurance to be related to, say, the MBS state of a building? What are our levers in improving or adjusting the way that the market responds to drivers for retrofit?
Well, I think the market probably already does respond. Perhaps it's a little bit crude, though. I mean, the insurers do look at percentage MBS. No disrespect to anyone in the insurance industry in the room. I'm not sure they always understand exactly what they're looking at. But I think those things are inherently linked already in terms of property values, but perhaps only in the markets where it's valued. And so in Wellington, if you upgrade your building, it probably means something in terms of property value. If you're in Eketahuna, don't know why we always choose Eketahuna, but it always seems to come up. If you're in Eketahuna, upgrading your building probably doesn't mean a hell of a lot for your market value. So I think it lends to Ken's point that there is a real difference between some of the markets where we value the percentage MBS and where we don't.
I would just add to that that I think there could be value in developing a new metric as an alternative to MBS that perhaps better represents likely damageability or cost of repair, and in which case that would probably make more sense to be sort of tied into market value or insurance premiums, because MBS is not the greatest measure of that. I don't think that's something that I'd actively support encouraging.
We'll take another one from the app. Another one for you, Jenni. I think people seem to enjoy the numbers game that you put on screen for us. That was very enlightening. You asked for support from MB to help you assist Wellington building owners. What sort of support are you looking for? And are Matt and Ken considering that in their current review?
So I'm not asking for support from MB. On behalf of building owners, I'm suggesting perhaps that there would be greater rates of compliance if there were assistance for owners who want to comply. In terms of what that might look like, I think we need to think a little bit creatively about what assistance could look like. It doesn't necessarily have to take the form of, money for strengthening changing hands. There could be something in terms of central government intervention in insurance markets, finance. There's so many brains in this room. I'm sure we can think of different ways of maybe making that happen. But ultimately, I think that if people really want to comply, then we should be trying to make it easy or assist them in some way.
I think Jenni said that beautifully, so I'll leave it at that. But just adding to her point of we need to be creative in this case. It's not going to be your simple funding from central government for your retrofit. We need to come up with creative ideas, and I welcome the ideas from everybody in the room.
And if I could take Chair's prerogative and follow-up question for Ken on that. In the jurisdictional analysis, you noted some of the observations that came through in terms of traits of successful retrofit schemes. How much of a role does support and the types of support play, and what schemes show success?
It's very important. Most of the programs internationally have shown, not surprisingly, connection between enhanced compliance when you have financial incentives to achieve to do the retrofits. But that form of financial assistance takes many different forms, so we got to figure out what form is feasible.
All right, we'll draw it to a close there. Another round of applause for our presenters. Very enlightening discussion, and we'll get on with the next half slot.